I really feel like the profession that I'm in is designed around how do we make sure that people feel welcomed, valued, respected, heard, included, all those pieces in the workplace. Hi, my name is Justin Brady-Joyner. My pronouns are he and him, and I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion at a tech company. I identify as queer, and I identify as somewhat gender nonconforming. So growing up, I was very involved in music and theater, a lot of focus on the arts, and that was a really vibrant and positive community for me. There were some queer people that I found out years later or decades later that just weren't out, but that were good friends of mine and were people that I trusted and valued. Got to connect with them. I wish I would have had more knowledge about their lives before, because I think that would have just been a different experience for me then. Grew up also in a very religious environment. My family was super religious and super connected to the church, and so a lot of even my music and arts focus was through the lens of a church environment. So I grew up in northern Colorado in a town called Loveland, Colorado. It's the Valentine's Day capital of America. Super silly and cheesy, but fun. It was a very small town environment. Did not see a lot of queer representation at all. The very little that I did was often framed in a way that was really negative. So kind of grew up in a space of recognizing that I was different in this space, not seeing examples of what that could be in a positive light, and being told to be afraid of the people that I did see. I hate to say that I didn't have queer role models growing up, but it's true. There's one man that keeps coming to mind anytime I think back on my past, and again, I just didn't have a lot of visibility or awareness of what his life was like, but he was a director of one of the shows that I was in, and I remember being told by my parents to never be alone with him, and I never really understood why, but it was rooted in their fear and their misconceptions about things. They had awareness that he was queer and that he was actually partnered for many, many years, which I found out later. I remember always feeling comfortable around him and really liking him, and being really confused as to why I was told just to avoid him or not be kind of alone with him.
Do you remember kind of at what point in your life you started to understand yourself as part of the LGBTQ plus community, and like what that kind of journey looked like for you?
For sure. So I was a late bloomer in terms of puberty anyway, so I think I didn't even have much of an understanding of myself, period, for a long time. Towards the end of high school, I started to recognize I was different, and it scared me because I felt like that difference was not okay. And it took a number of years through college and through connecting with people that gave me very different perspectives on this that helped me start to really come into my own. My junior year of college was really when I kind of see myself accepting who I was or who I am. I think at that point I would look back on it and say that I was reluctantly accepting it, whereas now I'm embracing it and it's a huge part of my life, and it's something I'm proud of. So when I started college, I went through the new student orientation process, and in going through that process, I realized this would be a really fun job, and I would love to help other students get connected to the university. So I applied to be an orientation leader that first year, and it was through that year that I got to know I got to know out queer people who were super confident and very much in their skin in a way that just felt different for me. I still didn't get fully immersed or involved in it, but I would go in and participate in some of the ally development trainings, telling people that I was an ally because that was the easier way for me to navigate in that space. And I remember that was kind of the first time that I was in rooms where there were more queer people than there were not, and thinking, wow, this is cool and feels different and feels exciting. Fast forward a couple years later, so I went to graduate school, and in grad school there was a very small queer community in South Carolina. It was a really different environment, and it was kind of the first place that I was out, which was also odd to be out in the South. But then I moved to Miami and I was involved in the Miami Gay Men's Chorus, and that I feel like is probably the most formidable experience that I had with queer community. That was kind of a time when I felt like I was embracing myself. I was also allowing myself to form relationships with people within this community. I was able to ask questions and understand from people who've navigated through things that I hadn't been through yet, and see pathways to my future that I just didn't see before. So when I moved to Miami, I moved for a job. I knew a few people at the university that I was working at, but wanted to have a community outside of work. And I attended one of the concerts for the Miami Gay Men's Chorus with a friend, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is like a mashup of my passion for performing and music and community and whatnot, but then also this level of visibility that was different. And the songs they were choosing and the messages behind them and the why behind it just felt so personal to me in a way that music performance before hadn't. And I remember at first being really nervous and feeling very exposed in a way that I hadn't before, just because I was in a space where people knew I was queer just by the fact that I was involved in the group. And also found right away how cool that can be and how freeing that can be if you let it, as well as watching other people kind of model that freedom and that comfort in their own skin was very helpful for me to start to kind of become more comfortable with who I am. I think it took a long time even after that to really fully embrace a lot of elements of my queer identity, remove some of the negative layers that I think I still had to shake off from childhood. But through that experience, I found really close friends. I dated a few people, so that was also a piece of it, which was kind of fun. Growing up loving the arts, loving graphic design, loving visual and music type of arts, I knew that art was a passion of mine. I didn't necessarily know that STEAM or STEM was a passion of mine at all, but found my way into tech kind of circuitously and in a different pathway, but I love it. My pathway started really focusing on music, journalism, and graphic design was kind of what I was pursuing initially, and then moved from that into the space of education, and that was really focused on higher education. So I wanted to work at universities where I was helping students navigate through their own different processes and transitions kind of from high school to college, from college on afterward, or any other life transition that people might go through too. Through that, ended up kind of bouncing around the country at different universities and ended up at UT Austin, where I was focused on leadership programs, which was great and such a different approach where it was more planning events, mentorship for students, helping them connect to people that could help them see pathways forward. And through those experiences, started to see the need for this within STEM and the opportunities that kind of exist within kind of the tech field too. Went from the School of Nursing to the Cockrell School of Engineering, and it was really when I was in engineering that I realized, wow, there's something so unique and different about what these students will get to do when they graduate and how they'll impact the world. I've always loved leadership development and people development and how do people come into an environment and feel able to fully be themselves and fully embrace who they are. I think a lot of my own personal experience of not feeling that way a lot of times led me to want to make sure that other people have that and have it earlier in their career. Inclusive leadership development was always a component of all this work. But then doing that inclusive leadership development in the engineering context, I really started to see a lack of visibility and a lack of support for queer students. And what we found over and over and over again was it wasn't these students weren't smart. They absolutely knew how to do the work. They absolutely knew math and science, and that's why they got admitted to a really elite university in engineering. The challenge was they didn't have the social support. They didn't have people in their life that were prodding them along. You need to be able to feel safe and comfortable and welcomed and included in this environment, and that wasn't always the case for our students. I think a big piece of living within your own queer identity is you're embracing the fact that you see the world in a different way. When we are able to fully accept and be who we are, we're able to operate in a space where we're not afraid, where we're not kind of navigating through this lens of, am I safe or not? And just discarding all of that and just being comfortable in your own space unlocks this ability to really think differently, to open up, to innovate in a way that's broad and open and different, and helps you see problem solving in a different way. I think a lot of queer people have navigated through different hardships, different challenges through life that might be unique to their queer identity. Having some type of experience of facing adversity and navigating through and moving past that really helps people develop leadership skills and helps people develop the ability to look at a problem in a very different way. That type of thing is so important when we look at innovating and creating. There's a lot of creative process in coming into your own. I know that for me, right now, the way that I'm presenting, I think is relatively masculine, and I think that a lot of times I put on nail polish and I dress in a way that's a little bit more feminine, and I play with and feel comfortable with gender expression in a different way. But you can only really do that when you feel safe to have that type of expression. The more queer people are in tech, the more queer people that are kind of in these different spaces, the more that others start to feel comfortable being themselves too, and see pathways forward and opportunities for them that they could move into that direction as well. So I think there's an element of living in your queer identity unlocks elements of creativity and innovation that translates to a tech environment really well, as well as there's elements of living openly and visibly in a way that's showing the world that you're comfortable with who you are and that you belong, helps open the doors for other people to see that pathway forward for themselves too. Kids look to see, can I see a representation of myself in the future? And if they're not seeing that type of visibility in the media and online and whatnot, then they're less likely to pursue their passions and rather more likely to kind of fall into buckets where people place them as opposed to following the directions that they want to go. What's interesting is when I left the engineering school and moved over to work for my first tech company, I moved to work for a company that a student who was a student worker in my office was also, he was graduating and he was going to start there later in August and I was starting in June. I knew that he was navigating through his own experience with his own queer identity. But what I didn't know until a handful of years later working at my company, we were on a panel together and we were talking about our queer identities and if we had role models. And he said that it was so important for him when he was a student to have me in the space regularly just living my life and that made him feel more comfortable coming out. And I had no idea that I had that impact on him. And he was someone that I was close with and someone that I was connected to. But the way that he spoke about me reminded me of the way that I spoke about and still would speak about continually some of the role models that I had in college too. So when I was in the engineering college and working at the university, during that time I was focused on student leadership development, but it started to broaden to focus on faculty and staff as well. And so I was able to do more trainings and facilitation around team building and inclusive leadership. So a colleague of mine had gone to NI for learning and development and helped me become aware of this opportunity to come in and be her peer. And I came into the company initially focused as the business partner for talent development with the R&D function. And so how do we solution around the different learning needs that our engineers needed? Coming into the company, I knew that there wasn't necessarily a D&I function. It was something that even during the interview process, I remember reaching out to one of our gay friends who had worked at the company for a decade. I remember asking him, you know, how comfortable do you feel? Are you out at work? What does that space look like? And his answers were great and affirming and positive and helped me see that, okay, if he feels comfortable and he feels great, I probably will as well. I also intentionally asked questions during my interview process to gauge some of that too. And my hiring manager was amazing and so felt comfortable coming in. That said, I still got to the company and realized we're not really talking about diversity and inclusion. I was working on this learning and development team and we were building trainings on performance management and I was asked to give feedback and input into it. And I looked at it and I immediately saw ways to improve it from a D&I lens and gave those suggestions and they were super well received and people were like, this is awesome, and we didn't notice that we were unintentionally sending these messages that we weren't wanting to and we want to be more thoughtful about that. Can you help us become more thoughtful about it? And so started to build some trainings for my own team around how do you be more inclusive in the way that you build trainings. And I thought back through my experience working in higher ed and thought, you know, some of the spaces we could begin would be to formalize employee resource groups. We had a grassroots women's network that was already thriving, but wasn't officially recognized. So we even already had one, we just hadn't called it that yet. I made some suggestions to our chief people officer of ways we could navigate forward. And she said, great, will you lead the next steering group meeting? And I was like, sure. And so that became a unique opportunity where they started to shift my role away from the talent development role I was doing and more towards building out what this D&I thing was going to look like. It started from a place of me as a staff person, the only full-time staff person working in that space back in the beginning of 2019. We had this D&I steering group that started, I think, during the end of 2017. I got involved in that at the beginning of 2018. And then fast forward to 2019, we established the function, which literally meant that I had a new job title, but that was what the function was. And over the course of 2018 to 2020, I think is when we really built out our employee resource groups. So that was a big formative first step for us. We went from having those 3 groups in our pilot to having 7 groups now within the US. And then we also have, of those 7 groups, 3 of them are starting to expand to have chapters around the globe globe as well. And then we had an LGBT lunch club that I hadn't ever attended because it was very hidden and hard to find at the company. Figured out they were gonna have lunch around the same time as we were building out this framework. Went to it, met all these people, and was like, hi, none of you know me, but I work in HR, we're building out this thing. I'd love for some of you to help me with this, with formalizing this into something more than a kind of hidden lunch club. And through that, they ended up being one of the first 3 employee resource groups. So our Pride group kicked off officially with National Coming Out Day, which was a bigger splash than I thought we were ready for. I was nervous about it, and it went so well. They got rainbow flags to go ahead and share around the office and have, as people walk in, they could pick up a flag or pick up stickers to go ahead and either have at their cube or whatnot, and some education about what this day meant, and also, hey, this group exists and we're new and we're building this thing. And the piece of that really felt critically important was for people to find others that were like them, to know that they were not alone. So that was kind of a starting place. But then also to find ways to talk about problems through a different lens. Some of the early benefits that we saw were cross-functional conversations that weren't necessarily happening when people were in their functional bubbles. When it comes to queer identities, we went from a place of a lot of queer people working at the company and within their silos feeling comfortable talking about their lives with their coworkers, but not necessarily knowing that each other existed, to a space where we have hundreds of employees now who meet regularly, who connect regularly, who are very visible, who put on events for the rest of the company for people to connect and engage. And it's provided a much more comfortable space for them, but then also a space for them to educate the company too. One of my favorite experiences that I've had working in DEI was actually working with a trans woman in our company who had reached out to me to say, I am in this process of transitioning. I don't know how to navigate that with my manager and with my team. Can you help me figure out some of these things? And I worked with them and with HR to figure out, how do we help this process be more smooth, and how do we make it sure that it's successful for her? And through that experience, then she came on board and said, I love the support I got. I wish this support existed before me. And she had found actually a lot of answers to some of these questions through meeting a few trans people that worked at the company who said, oh, when I went through the process, this is what I did, or these are the people that I had to talk with to change things like my name within our systems and on our emails and that kind of thing. And so some of the back end side of things that need to change and need to change swiftly for someone to feel like this process is supported and embraced by the company. But also, we didn't really have policies around this. We didn't have any practices or whatnot. That employee, to her credit, said, I love that I got this help and support. I wish it was better for me, and I want to make it better for other people. Can I help you build something? And so through her experience, we were able to build a better experience for future employees to transition. And what was fascinating was we built out this process, and part of that included education for our HR colleagues on how to be supportive and inclusive of our trans population. And that was brand new for most of those colleagues. And so there was a lot of learning and a lot of growth that needed to happen. But so much of where that came from was this one experience with this incredible employee. This work is on us. This is our work. It's not Justin's work in HR. It's not just HR's work either. Every single employee can do things that can help make sure that others feel included. I feel like there are a number of barriers within tech workspaces that LGBTQ people face, and some of that mirrors what's happening out in the world externally too, because that creeps into our workplaces a lot. I work at a global company, and some of the countries that we have large employee bases in have very different perspectives and viewpoints on what it means to be queer, and different laws and legislation and rules and policies and things around that too. And so that can be challenging when you're working in a global environment where you get some pockets of support, but where maybe there are people around the globe who just don't understand your experience, or who are at a different place in their own learning journey along those lines too. I think sometimes it can be hard to feel patient with people who've never had exposure. And I think there's a lot of importance around sensitivity and empathy in how you address that. I don't think it's appropriate for me to go to someone from another country and tell them, all of these things are wrong, you're doing everything completely ridiculous, and this is not okay, you have to be exactly where we are here today. But also, I need to address things to help make sure that our employees that live in environments where it's more okay for them to be out and open feel comfortable navigating and connecting with their colleagues around the globe too. So it takes a balance of really understanding where people are coming from, understanding the context in which they operate, and then how you kind of navigate cross-culturally some of these different pieces. When it comes to LGBT people in STEM, there's not a lot of representation, and I think that's really sad to see. When you look through history, we don't hear a lot around what different technology was built by a queer innovator. That's not something that's readily available or that's taught in schools. And so I feel like in general, there's not necessarily the visibility to help people see early on that there's a pathway for them. And then on top of it, I think a lot of times tech becomes very cisgender white male. If you don't really map into a lot of those spaces and you're a part of the queer community as a component of your identity as well, it can be really challenging to find mentorship, find support, find people within your own company that you can talk to and navigate. If you don't have access to seeing people that are thriving within those spaces, sometimes you can self-select not to even pursue them. And that can be really, really disappointing because you miss out in a really great opportunity. And more importantly, they miss out on you. And you're fantastic and have so much to offer. How do companies define leadership? And how that's often defined through a male lens, a cisgender male lens. It's often defined through a straight lens and through a white lens. And so there's all these factors that factor in the ways that we show up in a space. And if we don't show up exactly those same ways, we may not see a pathway forward, or others may not see us as ready for that pathway forward. My leadership and my approach to life is much more around wanting to be my authentic self and wanting to show up as I am. If I show up to a meeting and I've got nail polish on, that shouldn't be something that takes away with the importance and value with why I'm at that meeting. It should be what I have to say and my ideas and perspectives, and allowing me to show up in that space and embracing me to show up like I want to show up in that space is going to be something that's going to allow me to actually produce and provide what the company wanted me to do in the first place. Companies, I think, are starting to navigate through redefining what leadership means and hopefully seeing empathy as a core skill, seeing authenticity as a core skill, and vulnerability. And those are things that I think traditionally weren't seen as leadership qualities and kind of kept queer people out of it. And empathy is not something that you're just innately born with or you're not, and that's it. It is a developed skill, and it is a developed skill through practice and through storytelling and through art. And like that's where, when we look at the art in STEAM, that's where I get passionate about this connection. Because my pathway into STEAM and into tech was not really through science and math. It was more through the arts. It was more through education. But I see so much benefit and so much value in the creative processes that you learn from that, and the empathy skills that you develop as you're exposed to stories that are different than your own. So advice I would give to my younger self would be get to know and connect with people outside of your family who just represent a different perspective and different idea. And that could be within the queer community, but also way broader than that as well. I think I've learned so much more about myself through getting to know people who are different than me. With queer identity, I think one reality of it is you don't typically grow up in a queer family. Some people do, which is awesome, and we're seeing more of that, which is great. But for the most part, you're learning about what it means to be queer, sometimes on your own if you don't actually find support outside of your family. And that's not necessarily a knock on your family. They may care about this and value this, but they may not be able to directly relate and connect to your experience. So it's important to develop relationships with people who do represent that part of your identity earlier on. I would also say don't be so hard on myself. I think I still see that now that I'm in my 40s. I can find myself looking at what I have to offer and diminishing it and not recognizing the value that it brings. So listen when people tell me that I'm bringing value, because sometimes it's hard for me to actually believe that. And trust myself. I think that's a big piece too. Advice that I would give for queer people entering tech, I would say do your research about the companies that you're looking into applying to if you're at that stage already. There are wonderful, supportive, and amazing queer spaces within tech. And so if you can start at a company that already has that, that's going to help you thrive from the beginning. When anybody starts at a new job, they start in this headspace of trying to figure out if they can fit in. That is a truth for all humans. We all want that sense of belonging and want to understand that piece. For people from marginalized backgrounds and underrepresented backgrounds, we spend a larger percentage of our time and of our brain power trying to figure out that same answer to that same question, and often for a longer duration of time. So companies that have put in efforts to really embrace the queer community, they're doing the work to help you get to that space of understanding that you belong faster. But if you can't find that, it might be more challenging for you when you get there. The other piece I'd say is, if you're passionate about a company, you really want to work at a place, they don't have that yet, make that. Create that. Speak up and say, this is something that I think matters and needs to exist here, and make space for that. I spoke up at my company and really spoke up through the lens of not seeing us focusing on inclusion in a way that I just kind of was hoping that we would broadly across the board. And I found that other employees were starting to speak up too, and that some of our execs also saw this as important. But I never would have known that had I never spoke up. So I think it's important for all of us to recognize that the world is way bigger than our own experience. Through getting involved in things like employee resource groups, through reading stories, listening to other people's perspectives, watching things like these Paths interviews, it's providing opportunities for people to see identities that are different than theirs as well. And so, yes, embrace and learn from people that have shared identities from you, but also start to connect with and get to know what people's experiences are like that are different than yours as well.